Hello and welcome to our webinar. Today we will be discussing ForeFlight's trip support and how it bolsters your team with comprehensive trip planning that is tightly integrated with ForeFlight's dispatch and mobile app to maximize operational efficiency and communication. On the call today are Simpson Bennett and Brian Miller. Guys, introduce yourselves.
Hi there. So I'm Simpson Bennett. I am the product marketing manager here at ForeFlight. I have been with the company for about 10 months now, and I focus primarily on the business aviation products and services that we offer, and a lot of the kind of back end to launch these products from a marketing standpoint. So I've been in business aviation for the last handful of years, and prior to that, I was predominantly in avionics in similar kind of marketing and sales and product roles for the past decade or so. I am based in Melbourne, Florida, and yeah, happy to be here.
Hello, my name is Brian Miller, and I'm the manager of our global trip planning team, and I am based out of Columbus, Ohio.
And my name is Keith Wagner, and I am on the ForeFlight marketing team based in Seattle, Washington. Before we begin, I want to mention that you can ask questions using the Q&A panel and the chat function. We have a team standing by to answer your questions, and we will also take a few of the more popular questions that come in and ask them to our presenters at the end of the webinar. We tend to get a lot of questions towards the end, so if you have a question, I encourage you to submit it as soon as you think of it. If your question is not answered during today's webinar, you can always send it to us at team@foreflight.com. Lastly, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and website. With that, Simpson, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Keith. So ForeFlight's trip support was born out of Jeppesen International Trip Planning Team. So the Jeppesen International Trip Planning Team has 40 years worth of experience in kind of trip planning. It was definitely something that they saw a need in the marketplace a while back as kind of aircraft capabilities started to expand and the need for more robust planning for high performance jets and traveling internationally as kind of the complexities start to grow as you operate outside of not only your comfort area, but just domestically. And so we launched ForeFlight Trip Support in May of 2024, right before EAPIS, with our own kind of twist on it. So you're going to see a lot of the capabilities of ForeFlight Trip Support being relying on our incredible products that we have today that everybody has kind of come to use in operational sense. So that's ForeFlight Mobile as well as ForeFlight Dispatch and Web. So a lot of the capabilities that we've kind of plussed up trip planning with is based in our technology stack that we have to kind of improve flight planning and improve all these different calculations that jets kind of need, especially jets that are operating internationally. So a lot of our experience or a lot of our benefits and value is combining both the expertise of the planners on the Jeppesen team with kind of the power of the technology of ForeFlight's ecosystem. Our dispatchers that are planning flights have a lengthy experience planning trips internationally, but planning trips around the world, whether they're simple trips of just doing flight planning or complex trips where you have to coordinate all these different services and actually coordinate different elements of it. So like your overflight permits, your other kind of entry requirements, whether it's slots or something to that effect. So we've regionally based these dispatchers across the world, not only to support the various operations within those sections, but to kind of give a full comprehensive coverage of trip planning and kind of trip monitoring. So the team is, like I said, strategically positioned around the world to give the best support to our customers. And we handle tens of thousands of trips a year. So they're very well seasoned in handling trips. Like I said, both the simple request for flight planning all the way up to more complex ones where they're scheduling and coordinating a number of different services. And like I just mentioned before, the powerful tools behind the scenes that are helping them plan the trips and also coordinate all of these different elements within the trip are driven from the ForeFlight ecosystem. So like I mentioned, they're distributed across the world thoughtfully to make sure that they have the most ideal coverage for our operators, whether they're here domestically in the US or abroad, making sure that they have the experts in that region that know the certain quirks it might be for a specific country, or even down to the airport level. They know, something that might not be something that an operator who isn't operating in and out of there so often would know. They have those kind of relationships with those vendors, with those providers of services. And so they know which ones are going to be vetted, and they know which ones are going to provide the best level of service. So the team is attentive, and they provide that personal service and make sure that the vendors that back them up, that are actually providing the service to the aircraft, are going to be top notch. So some of the services that the team provides is, the complete trip planning support, whether that's from inception to planning out a trip, all the way and just doing the flight planning, and also those services that kind of tie into that. So they can really handle everything, whether that's catering, the permits, providing weather services to your pilots, so that they know what they're going to be encountering as they cross the Atlantic or cross, wherever, and making sure that they have the most up-to-date information right at their fingertips in ForeFlight Mobile. And as the flight progresses, one of the capabilities that the international trip or the ForeFlight trip support team has is that they are able to monitor your flight. A lot of our operators might just have a 9-to-5 operation, Monday through Friday, and the weekends are, something that the trip planner or the scheduler is going to have to come in and kind of monitor the flight, or take time out of their personal lives to make sure that they're watching the flight if the crew needs to deviate, or something unexpected comes up, that they can enact a backup plan. The trip support team can handle that. They monitor the flight. They're proactively providing communication. If they see that the flight is diverting to another airport, they can enact a plan to make sure that that aircraft is met with the services that they may need. And they're in constant communication. And one of the biggest values of the ForeFlight trip support team is they're basically an extension of your flight department, your flight operations. They know your SOPs. They're basically working as another scheduler, another trip planner on your behalf. So they're well versed in everything that you're doing operationally, and can enact plans quickly should a change comes up or something along those lines. And then of course, post-flight stuff that they handle, the handling, ramp parking. Here, domestically in the US, ramp parking, we kind of take a luxury and take it for granted sometimes, but internationally it can be kind of a challenge to find appropriate ramp space, especially for the larger aircraft. So they definitely have a good understanding of where they can find or where they need to go to get that approval to park an airplane for an extended period of time. And as the world is going through some changes right now, one of the big things is security, not only for the crew members and the passengers, but aircraft security on the ramp, ensuring that we're using a secured and trusted service provider, and that there's restricted access to the aircraft. That's something that the trip support team can help with in facilitating and finding, to make sure that there is appropriate security for your aircraft when it's on the ground and there's no one there from your operation. And that vendor network, like I mentioned before, is vetted and trusted. They're continuously going through evaluations to ensure that the highest level of customer satisfaction is there. And should there be any challenges or any issues with that, then they address that. It's not up to the operators to maintain kind of the Rolodex, if you will. I know I'm dating myself there, but a Rolodex of operation and service providers. So you don't have to do that yourself. The team here, the trip support team, can go ahead and handle that. And one of the big things is they have established credit. So they have the relationships financially with these vendors. So in some cases, they might not take credit card, or there might be some sort of billing uniqueness to their operation. The trip support team handles that. They settle the bill, and then we just bill you after the fact and after the trip. And we have flexible solutions too. Like I mentioned before, the real benefit here is that we can plan something as simple as just a single flight with just a flight plan, all the way through the coordination of services and slots and all of the minor details that come along with planning international trips. We can handle kind of it all. And of course, the big thing is fuel. So we have relationships with fuel vendors across the world, 3,500 different airfields, and we use what your preferred vendor is going to be. And we obviously surface that pricing that you have with that vendor to you. So there's no surprises at the end. There's no unforeseen fee or something along those lines that hits you at the end of a trip and that you just were unaware of. So we make sure to surface all of our pricing right at the beginning of a trip, or right at the beginning of the feasibility of a trip, so that what that price is going to be once you've concluded it and you're back home. And that's one of the big things is our quoting is highly accurate and very accurate, so there's no surprises there at the end. And lastly, like I had mentioned before, the biggest value to our operators is going to be the integration into the ForeFlight ecosystem. So whether it's the services that you'll be able to see here in the future through web and dispatch, you'll be able to go into your ForeFlight instance, see what services are booked, see what services are pending and kind of their status. No longer are you required to make a phone call to check on them or send an email to check on them. You'll be able to see that right in the dispatch and web and mobile ecosystem. You'll be able to see the services and their status, like I said, without making a phone call or sending an email. Your pilots will have access to released flights, just like you would if you were operating through your instance of dispatch and mobile. The trip support team works, like I said before, an extension to your operation. So they're using the same tools that you are familiar with and using today. And that's not to say that you have to be an existing ForeFlight customer today, but the value of having ForeFlight and being a part of the ecosystem is stronger in that instance. And the other thing too is that when your pilots show up to a destination, they'll have their services in ForeFlight Mobile, and they'll be able to see what has been kind of coordinated. If there's any kind of questions or confirmation numbers that need to be given, they can go ahead and provide that right then and there, as opposed to digging through an email or making a phone call. So there's the value in having it all integrated and all embedded within the ForeFlight ecosystem is tremendous, and saving a lot of time and back and forth between contacting the trip support team. It's all surfaced right there in front of you. Yeah, and like I said, the ForeFlight dispatch and web components are coming here soon. It's something that we're actively working on. The ForeFlight mobile integration has been released and is available today. Please contact us to help you activate it or kind of walk through how to see that services tab within ForeFlight Mobile, so your crew members can start to see all of the documentation, documentation, and all of the services and their statuses right within ForeFlight Mobile. And with that, I'll throw it over to Brian, who's going to cover trip support and the challenges of planning trips internationally.
Thank you, Simpson. So today I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the basics of trip planning, how to set yourself up for success, some of the intricacies of customs and immigration requirements across the globe, and then dive into some of the more complex regions and airspaces across the globe. So the first thing is setting yourself up for success, or trip planning 101. And what does this look like? So at its core, international trip and flight planning is a partnership. Success is driven by both sides, the operator and us as the service provider, all being on the same page. But what does this look like? First step is a successful onboarding process. This allows our team to get a proper introduction to your operations. There's a wealth of information and documents that are needed to arrange international services, from the most basic services to the most complex services. Information is needed to get things arranged. In this phase, we will gather information regarding your mandatory needs and your preferences as well. So when you're ready to execute your first trip, we have everything at the ready. For example, if your SOPs require a certain minimum landing fuel, we want to know this before we even prep your first flight plan. If you always like to receive fuel on arrival, we want to know this as well. These details help us provide seamless support. We want to be an extension of your team, and set you guys up for success. The next phase is the details matter. Organization is key. So when it does come time to plan that first trip, the more thorough and organized the information you provide directly impacts the foundation for which we'll execute the plan. I've seen trip requests in all formats. One is not necessarily better than the other, but as long as the information is complete and thorough and we have the necessary information, we can work with that. It's our job to organize the information and then go out and arrange the services. Ambiguous information leads to errors, even when we try and clarify information. Back and forth exchange of information is mandatory, but sometimes the details can get lost when the information isn't clear. I'd say the most common area I see this is when receiving times from pilots or aircraft operators. Simply saying we want to leave at 10 o'clock leaves a little bit to be desired. Am I to assume that this is a local time, or is it perhaps Zulu? These are some of the things that might not come across your mind as being important, but these are factor into making sure that we're able to support the mission exactly how you want. The next critical detail is understanding your limitations. As an aircraft operator, it's not a problem if you don't have the answers, nor is it expected. I've roughly 15, almost 20 years of international planning experience, and I routinely still need to look up and source information. Don't be afraid to ask questions or seek clarifications. That's where we can help. Maybe this is your first international trip ever. Maybe this is your first trip to a particular region of the world. Maybe you have 25 years of global international experience. Either way, our team is here to help at any step of the way. Next is understanding lead time requirements. Fortunately, most non-commercial international travel can be arranged relatively quickly, typically within less than a few days' notice. However, there are some limitations in areas that are less flexible. We can help set those expectations and explain where the most sensitive components of a trip are. I've seen approvals come in more quickly than expected too many times to count, so I never like to say something's impossible. But with that being said, our team is experienced enough to provide guidance on the official published lead times and also provide some real-world insight as to when approvals can be granted more quickly than what's published. Next is contingency planning. This doesn't need to be overly robust, but you at least have to have in your mind what happens if my initial plans fall through. Sometimes plans don't go always to script. This is most commonly occurs with finding aircraft parking, as Simpson alluded to earlier. Sometimes we're simply just not able to get long-term parking that suits your schedule. Customs availability always comes into play, as well as, crew duty limitations that might exist within your operation. So all this goes into continuous building of a relationship between us as your trip support partner and your side as the aircraft operator. The more we get to know each other, the better we are equipped to help each other out, and the more seamless everything falls into place. Most of these points are relatively common sense, but they truly are the basic fundamentals of the smooth trip planning international flight experience. So now moving over, I'd like to talk a bit about customs and immigration processes across the globe. So at this point, most of us are familiar with EAPIS. It's been around in the US for quite a while. Other areas across the globe are adopting these practices as well. Some of the more common ones you might be aware of are Mexican EAPIS, Caribbean EAPIS, but it doesn't really necessarily end there. One of the more notable ones that's planned to come online is Hong Kong to implement EAPIS for general aviation aircraft sometime in the next year. So our team stays on top of these developments and keep track of these requirements to make sure that your team stays in compliance. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into the US APIS side of things, because I think this is one of the more comprehensive EAPIS systems, and it kind of translates pretty well to the rest of the globe. The information that's needed for a US APIS is quite comprehensive. On the surface, it might appear that you're just transmitting, crew and passenger data, but there's a lot more that goes into it. For example, there's mandatory operator information, there's aircraft information, emergency contacts that are needed. So there's a wealth of information that goes into submitting an APIS. Fortunately, once we have this information in place, it's stored. We can retrieve it for the next one. So getting the APIS set up for the first initial transmission is the hardest part. From there, it's a much more seamless process. And with EAPIS on the US side, it's really the fundamental key to getting any service arranged with Customs and Border Protection. On the departure side of things, it's really the only element that's required for departure for a private aircraft. Once the APIS is submitted, the aircraft has clearance to depart in the eyes of CBP. For Part 135 or charter operations, there's another layer that goes into that where you need to actually seek departure clearance from the local CBP agent. But everything still ties back into submitting the APIS before you can receive any type of clearance. On the other end, when arranging arrivals or landing rights back into the US, this is where the APIS transmission is even more critical. CBP is not known for their customer service skills. They're very rigid in how they want things done. And unfortunately, it varies from port to port on how they want to receive information for an arrival. And the main key here is most CBP offices will not entertain a request for arrival until they can see that APIS. And this process can vary greatly from port to port. So for example, arrival back into Palm Beach International is a pretty quick and simple setup. Once the APIS is submitted, it's a quick call to their office and approval is granted right then and there. Whereas, for example, maybe Oklahoma City, the process might require more advanced notice. CBP agents, like I said, are not known for their customer service skills. They won't hesitate to withhold or deny landing rights if you don't follow their guidelines. As a provider, we realize that these differences between port to port are not ideal. We do have a good working relationship with the team that oversees the general aviation, customs and border protection process. So we can raise, issues that we encounter, or, where they're not following the rules that are set up by them. Unfortunately, this is more of a reactive issue and not proactive. So a lot of times we're not able to fix issues that we see in real time. And also want to touch on a newer program within CBP that allows overtime setup outside of business hours. And this is the reimbursable service program. In short, it allows stakeholders, whether it's a service provider like us, or an aircraft operator, or even an airport, to set up overtime for customs. So once this is approved and set up, you do have the ability to request service outside of normal ops, and make those overtime payment fees. The program does have some limitations on where it can be used, and it's not a guarantee that overtime will be approved. But this does allow for better efficiency for your operation, and can sometimes alleviate the unnecessary need for a stop purely for customs purposes. So the moral of the story for dealing with CBP is to get your EAPIS information in order and seek approval early. So transitioning outside of the US, a lot of requirements look and feel somewhat the same. Now, each country doesn't necessarily have their own EAPIS system, but they're generally going to require some kind of advance notice and information to set up services. Sometimes this is as simple as providing, basic crew and passenger information. Sometimes it requires actual copies of passports and visas. Our team works closely with local agents and authorities to make sure that we know what's needed in advance and everything can be prepared properly. We don't want anyone being left surprised when they arrive at an international location. One thing to highlight that's coming up on the horizon in Europe is are a few different programs that are likely to kick off in 2025, but these programs have been perpetually delayed, so it's still a best guess at this stage. So the first one is the European Travel Information and Authorization System, also known as ETOS. Basically, it's the European Union's visa waiver program, comparable to the US ESTA program, if you're familiar with that. So what ETOS does, it allows short-term stay for visa-exempt passengers to a number of European countries. Currently, it's slated to go live in the spring of 2025, but as I mentioned earlier, it's expected to be delayed again. So right now, spring of 2025 is the best guess. The next one is the Entry and Exit System, also known as EES. And this is a replacement for the manual passport stamping process. It's moving to a digital process. So in theory, this will be a quicker, more efficient way to get through border control. This one was actually supposed to go live on November 10th of this year, but has been delayed at least until April 2025. So it's a wait and see for both of these programs. One thing to note for both these programs, ETOS and EES, is they do not apply to private or private operators as of now. Although, as an exclusive private operator, if that's how your operation works, you can still apply to these programs in the event that these rules change down the line. More information can be found through the EU LISA site on how to apply to these systems and what's needed to sign up. Last are just kind of catch-all other considerations. Whether it's visa requirements, health requirements, pet requirements. The State Department is actually a really good source for this information to just for initial planning stages. The website is pretty user-friendly. The information is laid out pretty cleanly. But if you're ever in doubt, we can provide further guidance on this. But it's I definitely would encourage you to source this information in advance and then ask any follow-up questions to us that you might have. So while COVID restrictions have pretty much lifted and are a thing of the past, there's always going to be something else on the horizon. Before COVID, we had Zika. Before Zika, there was H1N1. So I hope we don't see anything that's significant as COVID was with impacting ops, but there's always going to be something on the horizon to keep tabs on. So don't be caught flat-footed on those. Next is pets. This is somewhat of a common thing that passengers will take their pets with them internationally. It's important to be transparent with this and let us know if pets are going to be on board. There are requirements pretty much everywhere across the globe to provide some kind of documentation and paperwork with this. Most notably, the CDC has published some new requirements in August of this year for bringing dogs and cats back into the US. So be aware, let us know when you are traveling with a pet and we can help fill in any of the gaps and make sure everything goes smoothly. So now I'd like to transition from the customs and immigration process to some of the complexities of different airspaces across the world. So the North Atlantic is the most common and complex overwater airspace that we encounter. It can be a webinar in itself with the complexity. So to operate in certain areas of this airspace, you'll need certain letters of authorization, as well as communication, navigation, and surveillance equipment. Absence of this equipment will limit where your aircraft can operate. The North Atlantic high-level airspace approval is required to operate anywhere between flight level 285 and flight level 420 in this region. To do this, you'll have to have the Bravo 039 letter of authorization in place, and this is displayed with equipment code X-ray in item 10A of your filing strip. Data link in the form of CPDLC and ADSC is also required for most of the NAT HLA region. If your aircraft's not equipped with this mandatory equipment, alternate planning will be required. This could come in the form of flying above the shelf at above flight level 420, or it could even be below flight level 285. Or there are different corridors within this region that are less restrictive on the equipment. So there are means of working around traversing this airspace if you don't have all the bells and whistles on board your aircraft. So this calls back to the importance of thorough and accurate onboarding of information. So a seemingly capable aircraft might be unexpectedly limited if we're unaware of the equipment that's on board. So for example, I used to work with a client who had a Hawker 4000, but didn't have CPDLC. And it was always a challenge to get the aircraft to climb above that NAT HLA shelf to go nonstop across the Atlantic. So this was a challenge even with having this information on hand from the beginning. So quite frankly, the last thing that any pilot or any passenger wants to hear about is news of an unexpected fuel stop. So having this information from the beginning can set the stage for expectations so everyone's on the same page and there's no surprises. Now, transitioning into European airspace, all flights arriving, departing, or transitioning Eurocontrol airspace must be valid with ATC. So Eurocontrol has a validation tool that gives you a heads up if a plan is valid or invalid. ForeFlight has this built into their system, so you know in real time if you've got a good route or not in the eyes of Eurocontrol. So typically flights in Europe must be planned on published airways for a plan to be valid. However, there are some more areas that are having free route, point-to-point routing that's acceptable, and this just allows for some more optimal routing. Finding a valid route can sometimes be challenging depending on when and where you're going. You know, there's lots of different factors that impact this. So while ForeFlight can often produce a valid routing, it might not always be the most efficient. Now, this is where our planning team can help save you time and money. We have additional tools and access to the Eurocontrol portal that can help us find the most efficient route of flight. You know, sometimes it's as simple as a minor change in altitude to turn a plan from invalid to valid. So our team is our experts in this area to help make sure that we're not adding additional flight time or inoptimal routing. Also within Europe, it's much more common for airports to be slot or PPR regulated. If you're unfamiliar with the term PPR, it stands for prior permission required. It's a bit of a catch-all phrase, but simply it's a local permit to operate in and out of the airport. The ease or difficulty of arranging slots in PPR can differ drastically from one airport to the next for a number of reasons. Some airports are very flexible and it's almost a formality. You know, you're going to get whatever slot you apply for, no questions asked. Other areas are not the case. It can be much more restrictive. An example of this would be, traveling to Europe in the summer. This is their peak travel season. There's an increase in traffic across the board, whether it's other GA aircraft or scheduled airlines. Simply put, the demand exceeds the supply. So Greece is really the poster child for this scenario. During the summer months, it's virtually impossible to get any kind of extended parking at the touristy locations in Greece. Many of the airports actually go out of their way to publish notams advising of, ground stop limitations. Typically it's 3 hours or less. So what happens here is, while you may be able to drop off your passengers at their intended destination, you're probably going to need to go park the aircraft long-term at a less touristy destination. So this kind of adds into some of the contingency planning from your initial plan that you have on script. Moving along to the Middle East, this is one of the most volatile and restricted areas of the world right now, whether it's restrictions or completely prohibited areas. Political conflict is much more prevalent in this region, as we can see with Israel. So you might not be able to overfly areas that you normally would. You might have to take different routes. With that, even in times of reduced conflict, the Middle East has a preferred route structure that needs to be followed. So this needs to be considered when flying in and out of this region. So for example, if we take a flight from the London area into Dubai, if you looked at the Great Circle routing, this would cross through Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So it's not practical to take a direct route. Syria is basically a no-fly zone, and Iraq and Iran change all the time. So the most common practice for this type of scenario is to fly, through Europe down into Egypt, across Saudi, into Bahrain's airspace, and then into Dubai. So this difference between Great Circle route and that route is roughly about 45 minutes, so not insignificant at all. One of the other things that is a hot topic in this region is GPS spoofing. This is most common around Israel, Cyprus, Lebanon, Syria. We have had accounts from pilots experiencing this, so we try and keep tabs on it. There's a lot of good third-party sources that show where spoofing is more prevalent and reported from other pilots. So I do encourage anyone flying in this area to share these events if you do run into any kind of spoofing. Sharing the information helps the industry as a whole. So transitioning out of the Middle East into Asia, there's a lot of similarities here as well to the Middle East, with the preferred route structure. But in terms of prohibited airspace, Russia is really the big one. I mean, it continues to be off limits, which impacts routing a flight between Europe and Eastern Asia. So we're not able to take the most efficient direct route as we were in the past. Now, I don't see this changing anytime soon, so I think we're going to have to live with this restricted airspace for quite some time. So kind of going back to the preferred route structure within Asia, this can be best highlighted in China. So part of the process for obtaining a permit in Chinese airspace is it's route specific. So when you get a permit approved for China, it comes with a published route that you must follow, and you can't deviate from it. So again, this might not be quite the most efficient route when you compare that to a Great Circle route. So outside of that, like the Pacific and South Pacific region, highlighting the main issue here is just to be aware of how big and remote this part of the world is. It's critical that an aircraft has the range capable for emergency planning. In a emergency depress situation, we need to make sure that we don't run into any scenarios with a wet footprint or anything, just because the amount of suitable diversion airports are so few and far between. It's not like the North Atlantic, which is quite smaller region, and the North Atlantic also has much more suitable alternates for contingency planning. So keep that in mind for Pacific planning. Transitioning back into Africa, Africa operations present a number of challenges for a few different regions. So each country requires a permit to land or overfly. Now on the surface, this is not that uncommon. generally outside of North America or Europe, a landing permit or overflight permit is going to be required. So this is not just unique to Africa, but Africa has, so many different countries, so many different fur regions. It becomes a little complex in making sure that you have all of your permissions in place for any flight in that region. Another issue that we encounter in this area is the actual approval process for permits. Sometimes the authorities don't issue permits in a timely manner. Sometimes we get them last minute. Sometimes they change the requirements as to what's needed to apply for a permit. So the process can be challenging and can change in a relatively short period as to what's required. Again, our team is very familiar with this region. We've got good established relationships with agents and local authorities, so we can stay on top of this. Also, like the Middle East, there are areas of instability or turmoil from a political standpoint, limiting where you can overfly, as well as sometimes a lack of ATC services. The last thing I want to touch on is Cuba. We get a lot of requests for Cuba. Recently the restrictions have been lifted in a sense between the US and Cuba. However, at this time, our specific OFAC license still only allows us to arrange overflight services. We're still prohibited from arranging any ground services or permits for Cuba. So this is a common question we get, but unfortunately at this time, we can only arrange overflight services. So to wrap all this up, each region of the world has its own unique planning considerations, but as I've touched on each region, you can kind of see a little bit of the similarities on planning considerations for this. So bottom line is we can help guide you to make informed decisions in the best routing that's in line with your operations and taking safety into consideration for all aspects. So to close this out, I want to just talk about some of the gotchas that come into play with international trip planning. And a lot of this, again, goes back to just the fundamentals that we spoke on earlier. So incomplete or inaccurate information can slow down the planning and execution of a trip. It can't be overstated how important good information is to set up services. Again, not being prepared for a backup plan. As stated, sometimes things don't go in accordance to plan. Our team are experts and dedicated to making sure your mission gets accomplished. However, sometimes things don't go according to the script for reasons outside of anyone's control. The next is not asking questions. That's what we're here for. We're here to help. Don't hesitate to ask questions or seek clarifications. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Again, this is a partnership. And lastly, it's a dynamic environment. It's ever evolving. Requirements change. New things get implemented. Our team stays on top of this. We track the changes. We track the updates to rules and regulations. We keep up with the best practices. Let us be your guide. Let us, be the experts and take the hassle off of you guys. And finally, I just want to talk about the data privacy and safety aspects of international flying. There's no way around it. International travel requires the exchange of personal information and sensitive information. It's our policy to safeguard any of this information that we touch. We encrypt all personal information and only send encrypted personal information when required to set up a service. This is not optional for our team, it's mandatory. I want to make sure that everyone has peace of mind over this, because personal information needs to be safeguarded. And lastly, safety is always our #1 priority. Our team, we emphasize safety above all else to our planners, and we reinforce this with a weekly safety message that goes out to our entire global team. We then empower our team to speak up and if something feels unsafe. So regardless of where your travels take you, we have your back. So that is it for me. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Brian. Now let's move into our Q&A session. Simpson, the very first question is for you. How does ForeFlight Trip Support select its preferred ground handlers?
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, absolutely. So, great question. There's actually an internal team that kind of handles all of our vendor relationships, since there's obviously a lot of them throughout the world. So there's a dedicated team that kind of is responsible for managing those relationships, making sure that the quality of standards is, up to the level that we expect, and they're constantly evaluating that quality and making sure that it's the top level of service across the world. And they're like I said, they're constantly evaluating them, getting feedback from our customers, and making sure that we're using the best providers out there.
Absolutely. Brian, next question's for you. And you touched on it earlier. I was hoping you can expand upon it a little bit more, but just how experienced is the trip support staff?
Yes, so Jeppesen International Trip Planning Services has been around for over 40 years at this point. Many people on our team have upwards of 20 years experience. So I've been a part of this group since 2006, and some of the people that I work with have been working in ITP for longer than that. So a well-experienced and seasoned team, and even with that, we do have a lot of, we don't have a lot of movement within our team. People come on board and stay on board. So even some of our less experienced planners still have upwards of 5+ years.
Simpson, does ForeFlight Trip Support allow the use of ground handlers or FBOs that are not on your preferred vendors list?
Great question. Of course. So the team will work as an extension of your operation. If you prefer to use a particular vendor, or an FBO or a service provider or someone along those lines, we will work with kind of the team that you've designated, or the vendors that you've designated to provide the service. So if you particularly use an FBO or a certain vendor at an airport, we just need to know that when you're planning the trip, and they'll go ahead and coordinate through that if it differs from who we already have as a vendor on that field.
Excellent. Thank you. And question for Brian. A customer reached out and asked, will I be invoiced by ForeFlight or by Jeppesen?
So if you're coming to us to utilize international trip planning services, it will be invoiced through Jeppesen.
Excellent. Thanks for providing that clarification there. And Simpson, another question that came in, since everything on ForeFlight is handled sometimes through email or sometimes through mostly digital kind of ways, I was curious if there's a best way to get a hold of the trip support team and what their availability might be.
This is where it differs a little bit from previous ForeFlight experiences. So yes, we do have an email and your portal, your support portal, depending on your method of communication. But this differs a little bit more. The team is available 365 days a year, 24/7. So they're working in a like I had mentioned in the intro, they're distributed across the world to make sure that there's full coverage throughout the year and throughout the days. There is a direct phone line for immediate trip support. So something comes up, a change happens, you'll have a phone number, your pilots or you will have a phone number that you can reach out to and communicate whatever the change is, or make sure that they have the latest information or something along those lines. So that's where it differs a little bit. There is a direct phone line directly to the trip support team, and there'll be somebody there to help address whatever the situation is.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Brian, next question came in for you. When you were talking about optimal routing through Central Europe, a customer asked if the crew can do it themselves, and if so, or what there might be a charge for this. Hoping you can expand upon that a little bit.
Yeah, so our services are customized to suit however you guys operate. So, if you're comfortable taking care of the flight plan aspects yourself through ForeFlight Dispatch, that's fine. There's no charge from it on our side. However, we do have a lot of customers who do want us to take on that, whether it's because they're unfamiliar with routing in those areas, or they just simply don't, have the time to take care of it. So if you do come to us for support in those aspects, there is a charge. However, if you're comfortable taking care of it directly in your ForeFlight account, there's no charge on our side for that.
Thanks for that extra info. And Simpson, question for you. What does the cost structure look like for all of this?
Yeah, so that's always the follow-up question of, what is trip support, and then how much is it going to cost me, right? So the cost structure is pretty flexible. We have the ability to provide ad hoc services, so therefore we're flexible on the cost for those. If there's something specific like a flight plan, and not the full gambit of services to support the trip, the cost is just for the flight plan. It's not for any other service outside of that. The flexibility also extends to if you add those services. If you want just catering and you want something else, the cost is flexible in that regard for an ad hoc basis. We do offer the capability to be signed up as a longer term kind of subscription, where you're doing a lot more of the flights through us. So we have the ability to kind of set up a subscription structure that is a little bit different than the ad hoc one. It's a little bit more defined as far as what the services are. And that's where sales really gets involved and can help kind of walk operators through that question. But really, and I kind of mentioned this in the intro, is that it's really flexible and tailored to your operation and your budget constraints and kind of what you need. You're not going to pay for things that you don't need or anything along those lines. So we really try to do our best to tailor it to your operation and your needs and your budget constraints.
Thanks for filling in some of that info there, Simpson. And finally, for Simpson and Brian, as you can see, a couple more questions have come in. I want to give you the opportunity to select from any of those questions, or if not, offer some parting thoughts about trip support before we wrap up here.
So I'll take the first shot at it. Basically, back to the fees and the services that we can provide really comes down to us being able to be an extension of your operations and really kind of working within your operations, your cost structures, and everything along those lines. I saw that there was one question specific around estimates of costs and those sorts of things. The quote that we provide on the onset of the services that we'll provide is what it's going to be, right? Unless there's some sort of foreseen addition at the end of a flight that wasn't kind of defined, if there was a change in destination or something along those lines that changes it greatly, that would be, of course, different. But our estimations and our quotes at the beginning of a trip is what you're going to be billed for at the end. And that's really, what we strive for, is to make sure that your estimate of cost at the beginning of a trip is what you're billed at the end of the trip. No surprises, nothing like that. And again, it's really tailored to your operation and extension of your operation and what you kind of need. And then there was one other one that was asking about, is this a replacement for Jeppesen ITPS? And think of this as just if you're a ForeFlight customer, if you're a ForeFlight user, this is another way to interact with the trip support services. Jeppesen ITPS isn't going to be going away, but this ForeFlight trip services is something where you'll have more capabilities if you are a ForeFlight user to see things like your trip statuses within mobile, and then soon to come, of course, web and dispatch. You'll be able to see services that are provided in there. And we'll work to expand those capabilities within both those platforms. But there's really a value of, if you are a user today in the ForeFlight ecosystem, to use ForeFlight trip support because of those kind of additional benefits with being able to surface statuses of services and things along those lines. There's no need to call into the trip support team to ask for, the status of a permit. You'll be able to see that right away, and your pilots will be able to see that in ForeFlight Mobile as well and have confirmation codes. So it kind of reduces that communication back and forth. Everything is just within the ForeFlight ecosystem.
And yeah, we got a question here asking if you have to have a ForeFlight dispatch subscription to use trip support. So simply put, no, you don't have to have a dispatch account for us to provide support. I guess I will ask Simpson if he wants to expand upon maybe some of the limitations for not having a dispatch support, but I just wanted to, simply state you don't have to have that to provide for us to provide trip support for your operation.
Yeah, correct. And there's value, like I'd mentioned before, there's value in being a user, but it is not a requirement to be one.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, Brian and Simpson specifically, for sharing your insight. And I also want to thank the ForeFlight staff working behind the scenes to help bring this webinar to life. And lastly, I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded and it will be available on our website and YouTube channel within 24 hours. If your question did not get answered in today's webinar, you can always look at more resources available on ba.foreflight.com, and you can also email us at info@foreflight.com. Thank you so much for joining.